Good evening, my friends. I am Lino. I've noticed something interesting and a little strange about the way many Chinese parents raise their children. When kids are very young, parents try to fill their minds with all the most beautiful values in the world. They tell them, be kind, be honest, be upright, be obedient, help others, treat everyone equally, believe that the world is good. Teachers say the same things. If you look at Chinese elementary school textbooks, many of the stories are about moral examples. A child returning lost money, a student giving up his seat for an elderly person, a worker sacrificing himself for others. The message is always very clear. If you are a good person, if you are honest, hardworking, and kind, the world will reward you. Parents want their children to grow up to be almost like saints. But here comes the strange part. When those same children grow up, when they enter college, or especially when they start working, the same parents suddenly begin to say completely different things. They start telling their kids, you can't be too honest. You need to be more flexible. Don't take principles too seriously. Just listen to your boss. Sometimes you have to flatter people. You might even hear parents say something like this, if you're too straightforward, you'll suffer in society. So a very strange situation appears. A person spends his entire childhood being taught to be honest, upright, and kind. But when he finally enters the real world, everyone tells him, if you really behave like that, life may be very difficult for you. If you grew up in China, you probably know this feeling. When you were a child, teachers told you, character is the most important thing. But when you grow up, reality tells you, connections are the most important thing. When you were a child, adults said, you should always tell the truth. But when you become an adult, they say, some things should never be said out loud. When you were a child, people said, everyone is equal. But as you grow older, you start to notice that society is full of hierarchy, status, background, relationships, and power. So many young people feel a deep sense of confusion. If the world is really as good as you told me when I was young, why does it look so different now? This contradiction in education actually reflects something deeper about society. Most Chinese parents are not naive. They have spent decades navigating real life. They understand very well how the system works. They know how important power can be. They know how important personal connections can be. They know that sometimes rules are flexible. But they also feel uncomfortable telling their children these things too early. Because if you tell a child from the beginning that society is full of hidden rules, power structures, and complicated human relationships, it sounds too harsh. So many parents choose a safer approach. First, they teach their children idealism. Later, when the children grow up, they slowly introduce realism. It sounds reasonable. But the problem is that this change often feels very sudden. A person might spend the first 18 years of life inside a moral story about how the world works. Then, after graduation, they suddenly discover that the real game has very different rules. I can't help but laugh when I think back to when I first started working. I did miss out on a lot because of that moral education and fell far behind those smart people. Before, you were encouraged to be a good person. Now you are encouraged to be a smart person. Before, you were told to stick to your principles. Now you are told not to be too rigid. This shift can feel confusing, sometimes even disillusioning. For many Chinese young people, the first real lesson about society doesn't come from school. It comes from the workplace. They begin to notice things like this. Hard work is not always the most important factor. Talent does not always decide everything. Sometimes a person's background, connections, or even one dinner with the right people can matter more than years of effort. And when young people bring these frustrations back home, parents often give a very classic response. That's just how society works. In China, this sentence is almost a universal explanation. If something feels unfair, people say, that's how society works. If a rule doesn't make sense, people say, that's how society works. Over time, many people learn to live with two different value systems. One is the public language of morality. The other is the private understanding of reality. In public, you talk about principles, ideals, and sacrifice. In real life, you learn about relationships, favors, and flexibility. This double logic shapes the way many Chinese people navigate the world. On the surface, they may speak the language of morality, but privately, they understand very clearly how things actually work. This is not always hypocrisy. Often, it's simply a survival skill learned over many years. That's why many foreigners who observe Chinese society sometimes notice a strange contrast. On one hand, the official narrative and education system are full of moral ideals. On the other hand, many people privately understand the practical rules of power and relationships. And Chinese young people often grow up caught between these two worlds. They are taught to become ideal human beings, but they are expected to survive in a very realistic system. That's why there is a saying in China, "When we were children, we were taught to become saints. But when we grow up, we are expected to become seasoned operators." If you grew up in China, you probably understand this feeling. The long journey from idealism to realism is almost a rite of passage. Sometimes I think the real problem is not that parents are hypocritical, and it's not that children are naive. The deeper problem might be that society itself is telling two completely different stories at the same time. One story is about ideals. The other story is about reality. And every adult eventually has to find their own place somewhere between the two. Does this happen in your country too? Please let me know in the comments.